Welcome to History's Influence. It's often argued that Russia is both a European and Asian nation. Not just because of their lengthy geography, but because of the impact of the Mongol invasions, which had transformed them into a civilization arguably separate from the rest of Europe. The Mongols had sacked and conquered most of the Kievan Rus, the precursor state for the modern Slavic nations of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. These invasions shaped the character and future of the region, allowing for Russia to come to prominence as a superpower, and causing Ukraine and Belarus to form their own national identities. This is particularly relevant to the modern conflict we see between Ukraine and Russia. So, what would happen if the Mongols had never conquered the Rus? Would Russia never come to exist? Would the destiny of the Eastern Slavs be forever changed? All these questions and more will be answered in this alternate history. The Mongol Empire split into 4 separate khanates, with the Golden Horde inheriting the conquests within Europe. If you'd like to see what would happen without the other 3 khanates existing, you can check out part 2 of my No Mongols series. In fact, whilst this video is standalone, it also acts as a final part for the trilogy. Anyway, who exactly were the Golden Horde, and how would the world fare without their presence? They were founded by Batu Khan, who conquered the lands of Eastern Europe, as commanded by the great Khan Ogedai. Their name came from later Russian chroniclers, either based on the golden tent Batu would reside in, or to symbolize their great wealth. They were indeed prosperous. Following their establishment in 1242, they largely sourced their wealth from their indirect extractive rule over the lands of the Rus. The Mongols maintained their base of control from the nearby steppe, a more suitable environment than the settled lands of the Rus, given their Mongol origins. This allowed for more longevity compared to the Yuan dynasty and Il Khanate, who didn't last longer than a century. It's important to note that the small amount of Mongols ruling the Golden Horde eventually assimilated into the Tatar groups who were present in the region for centuries. I'm talking about the Turkic ethnic group, not the source. Despite the Turkic assimilation, the Golden Horde eventually split into numerous rump states, most of which were conquered by the Russians later. These were mostly irrelevant, but the Uzbek and Crimean Khanates are worthy of note. So, who was in charge of the Tatar steppe before the Mongols had arrived, and how would their leadership develop in this new timeline? The Tatars by this point were led under the disunited Cumanian Kipchak Federation, led by the Cumanian and Kipchak tribes. They weren't a noteworthy people, and didn't leave a large mark on history. They weren't nearly as aggressive as the later Tatar Khanates who descended from the Golden Horde were. Aside from the Mongols, we don't have any evidence a dangerous group was waiting from the steppe, which is good, given the Rus share a worryingly flat and indefensible border with them. Europe would remain unscathed for at least a century or 2 in this new timeline. But this situation won't last forever, and the prospects for defense would rely on how the Rus would develop. So, let's figure that out, shall we? Before the Mongol invasions, the culture of the Rus held a large Byzantine and Orthodox Christian heritage, which won't be changing in this new timeline. The Lands of the Rus was the official name of the state. It was later coined the Kievan Rus by Russian historians to signify the capital of Kiev. It was a state created by the Rurikid dynasty, who were Proto-Swedish Vikings. The Rus were once powerful, but had become decentralized through a feudal fragmentation. They held no clear succession system for their leadership, leading to different noblemen acquiring power in different regions. The disintegration of states was occurring elsewhere in Europe at the time, namely in France and Germany. This process had already occurred by the time the Mongols arrived, leaving the Eastern Slavs under the threat of foreign occupation. To understand how the Rus would have managed without the Mongols, let's explore how the Tsardom of Russia was formed within the Tatar yoke. The old capital city of Kiev became irrelevant through the fragmentation of the Rus. The devastation of the initial Mongol invasions held an even stronger impact, moving the population and power base of the Rus up north. So, without the Mongol conquests, we're going to see the Rus hold a more southern power base. Throughout the lands of the Rus, a long-term economic depression set in place from the initial conquests, and the later subjugation to the Tatars. However, the unscathed Republic of Novgorod did not face such financial woes, only needing to pay tribute, which seems to have waned after a few decades. The Novgorodians would still remain in relative isolation from the southern Rus, so I believe they would continue to develop in a similar trajectory. But I don't think the Novgorodians would go further and try to create a unified Russian state for themselves. They were a trading republic, not a conquering state, instead choosing to colonize the Arctic for furry trading. Wait, no, I mean fur trading. This is despite the opportunity seeming ripe, considering their relative strength to the principalities. It's interesting to see this angle of Russian civilization you don't hear much of, different to the autocratic Russia we think of today. Now, where did Russia develop that impulse from? During the period of the Tatar yoke, the Golden Horde initially kept the principalities of the Rus weak and divided through raids. Think back to part 1 of the series, in which we explained how the Chinese dynasties would play the different groups within the Mongol steppe against each other, to ensure they wouldn't break their precious walls. By 1328, the Grand Duchy of Moscow was preferred by the Golden Horde for tax collection. This centralization was chosen due to convenience, so they wouldn't need to receive tribute from too many different principalities. But it also kept the ever-growing Grand Duchy of Lithuania from conquering their subjects' lands. The Muscovites would grow in power, eventually declaring themselves the Tsardom of Russia under Ivan the Terrible. Over 200 years after the Mongols had invaded their lands, they had become free of the Tatar yoke by this point as well. They were able to pull off such an impressive expansion for numerous reasons, and uniquely impressive rulers, whose benefits both won't be reaching the Rus in our new timeline. For starters, the tax collection and administrative systems they adopted from the Mongols were far more exploitative than what was present beforehand. Not having this centralization of taxation will reduce the ability to gather funds for expansion. The weakness of the Kievan Rus' succession system was turfed. Muscovy, starting from a small but centralized power base, instead held a more consistent line of succession. Their unique position of authority over the other principalities helped secure it further. So in our new timeline, this strong centralizing authority will have more difficulty coming to fruition. But conversely, without the Mongols initially keeping the principalities weak, they would have had more time to develop power bases themselves, even if they wouldn't be as effective as Muscovy. A strong autocracy had developed within Russia, similar to the Byzantine Empire of old. But we see a further degree of despotism. Take the example of Ivan the Terrible, as he humiliates and wrecks the boyars. Scholars argue this is where their Mongol influence on their governance really kicks in. There's no consensus on the Mongols' impact though, but I'd lean towards it being meaningful. I don't see how the factors we've discussed would not cause such a thing to happen. The Golden Horde were brutal, and so became the Russians, as opposed to the old Rus. This means in this new timeline, the Rus will be further hampered from being able to centralize and exert power as a unified state. There's also the system of serfdom, which developed through the particular machinations of the Muscovite state. By the mid-1600s in which it was codified, most Russian peasants worked as serfs, essentially being slaves. The only key difference being that they were tied to the particular lands they worked on. This system won't be perpetuating without the power of the Tsardom in place, which institutionalized the practice, and in which the boyars acquired more and more power following the Mongol conquests. Additionally, the Russians bared a heavy cost from the invasions and slave raids of the Mongols' successors. Without them, they would be more able to economically develop, and not need to tax the peasants so high to account for such raids. I don't believe the raids would be as severe without the initial Mongol influence on the Tatars. There's also the high yields of the Ukrainian fields, that rhymed, which would benefit them since their power base would be closer to the south. So, we'll see a less oppressed, but also less unified, Rusian people as a result. With the factors we have mentioned, in this new timeline, we're going to see a handful of principalities eventually come to positions of dominance, but there won't be a strong unified state emerging, at least not in the near future. Now, let's see how the Rus would fare against their neighbours. After the Mongol conquests, the Polish had reunified after decades of infighting and fragmentation. The Lithuanians instead unified for their first time, gathering from separate tribes into a powerful centralized state. These developments won't be changing in this new timeline. But as a side point, Casimir III of Poland explicitly laid policy to encourage the settlement of Jews in Poland, where the Ashkenazi Jews, originally from Germany, had migrated to. He led 100 years after the Mongol conquests. I don't believe this same circumstance would occur in this new timeline. So as a result, the future of the Ashkenazi Jews would be up in the air. Maybe they'll stay in Germany or move to another location. Anyway, historically, the Polish and Lithuanians would encroach upon the Rus, starting around 80 years after the Mongol conquests. These developments would lay the foundation for the modern nations of Belarus and Ukraine. But in this new timeline, the Rus won't be so easy to conquer. They wouldn't be leftovers from a brutal Mongol conquest. They would have more time to centralize that they weren't given in our own timeline. They wouldn't be under the domination of the Mongols, and the south would remain a viable region of power where the Polish and the Lithuanians conquered. Additionally, there was still another state which caused the Polish and Lithuanians headaches, which they would also have to account for. I'm referring to the Teutonic Knights. They were originally a military society from Crusader Jerusalem, but they later conquered pagan Baltic groups to establish their own states in northern Europe. But even with this useful distraction, the Rus wouldn't be strong enough to conquer or permanently weaken the Poles or Lithuanians themselves. But still, without the Polish or Lithuanians conquering the Rus' land, we won't see the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth be created. This would lend towards small, tightly knit states maintaining themselves in this new timeline, without the Commonwealth or Tsardom of Russia coming to fruition. But what would happen to the neighbouring Tatars? Wouldn't they try to conquer the Rus? In terms of defensibility, the pre-Mongol armies of the Rus were slow, disorganised foot soldiers. On the other hand, the Muscovites had an army largely comprised of organised cavalry. I think it's inevitable that the nomads neighbouring the Rus would use this to their advantage and would begin encroaching upon the Rus, even if we assume stagnancy for a couple of centuries without the Mongols existing. But we're also assuming from part 1 of the series that a really large nomadic empire won't come to fruition, meaning there won't be an existential conflict for the Rus. Instead, this conflict would further centralise the principalities of the Rus. I believe they will shift to a more cavalry-focused style of warfare, albeit more mildly than they did in our timeline. Perhaps smaller outskirt principalities would become more notable as a result, shifting power eastwards. Therefore, we would expect some of these smaller nomadic groups to be assimilated into the Rus. This would put the existence of the Cossacks into question. They were a primarily Eastern Slavic, Russian-Ukrainian group, who played an essential role in combating Tatar raids and helping with the expansion into Siberia. They also played a key role in creating the modern Ukrainian identity. The contested regions between the powerful empires of Russia, the Commonwealth, alongside the Ottoman-backed Crimean Khanate, gave the Cossacks room to develop an independent power base, even if they helped the Russians in their state expansion. The autocracy of Russia had encouraged many of them to seek refuge in the region as well, which won't be a factor anymore. They became hardened through combating the brutal Tatar raids, whose severity was dependent upon the initial Mongol conquests, as we mentioned previously. Without these particular circumstances, I don't believe the Cossacks would exist in this new timeline. Without the Cossacks playing their key role, would the Rus still expand into Siberia in this new timeline? I don't believe so, and they wouldn't be the only concern. Take the postal yam system, inherited by the Russians from the Golden Horde, which was originally sourced from Ogedai Khan. It was a useful tool for long-distance communication along the large swathes of the steppe. This particular system would not be transmitted in this new timeline, weakening the potential for the Russians to exert control into Siberia, through their outposts plotted along the way. The Rus would also not be unified as one power, so they wouldn't be free to exert themselves and reach their geographical boundaries, as large powers often do. A scramble for Siberia won't occur between the different Rus principalities in this new timeline. This is because there's really only one route through Siberia, and the other principalities would stop each other from taking the route. As a result, Siberia will remain a region of nomadic tribes of numerous origins, and it would be too difficult to predict the precise details of who would be where. However, as the Europeans would become more technologically advanced than their neighbours, the neighbouring steppe states may be conquered by the Rus. How effective these conquests would be really depends on the dynamics between the Rus and the steppe peoples, and the factions between the two groups. I'd predict mild outcomes given the Rus' preoccupations with the Polish, Lithuanians and themselves. A more drastic outcome could be a strong Rus state, developing power from conquering steppe regions, then going on to unify parts of the Rus and potentially going further east. I'd lean against this happening, although it's getting pretty speculatory by this point. A lack of Siberia, alongside a lack of Mongol influence, would drastically impact the way the East Slavs would view themselves, particularly the Proto-Russians. This relates to the key concept of Eurasianism. Its basic tenets are that Russia is not European and not Asian, but instead its own civilization. The German polymath Oswald Spengler saw Russia as a distinct culture, not yet finding or expressing its own soul, unlike the declining Western powers of the 20th century onwards. Obviously, it's important to remember their European, particularly Greek and Byzantine heritage. There's also figures such as the Tsar Peter the Great, who successfully molded Russia to become more Western, through reforming culture, religion, military, abolishing slavery, etc. In this new timeline, I don't believe any of the Rus would transition to developing a potential new civilization. I believe they would remain European in orientation, accepting that steppe-based power possibility we described. There's also the point of Russia's historical narrative, steeped in numerous periods of hardship. Without intense invasion and the later autocratic governance, I don't believe this adversity would perpetuate in this new timeline. An earlier change would be that pieces of Russian folklore, primarily depicting defiant yet doomed resistance from Mongol occupation, won't exist. More important would be the famous Time of Troubles, which occurred due to weak leadership in what was meant to be a strongly autocratic state, alongside difficult warfare and famines. The Tsardom of Russia did not control the high-yielding wheat fields of Ukraine by this point, however, and such a strong autocracy won't exist. The particular circumstances within the Russian Empire that led to the Communist Revolution would also be put under question, but this is so far away it'd be silly to make any predictions. Vodka will still exist, however, whose effect is known to cause rabble-rousing and violence when ingested by Slavic individuals. But this is something people in this new timeline will need to put up with, just as we do. On that sobering note, we will leave the video there. I hope you all enjoyed it. I started working on these Mongol videos in January, so it's nice to finally have completed it. This has been History's Influence. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe. Catch you later.